Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. And first up, China is intensifying efforts to avoid a Japan-style debt deflation trap, which risks pulling the country into decades of stagnation, experimenting with everything from baby subsidies to tax breaks. Yet a new International Monetary Fund (IMF) study suggests the vast industrial policy framework underpinning the world's second-largest economy may be doing as much harm as good. Industrial policy, an umbrella term for cash payments, credit subsidies, tax breaks, land grants, and regulatory barriers, has been a defining feature of China's growth story since the late 1970s. These measures have helped fuel the country's transformation into a global manufacturing hub, and it has also fueled some of the biggest issues, imbalances, and bubbles that the country has seen over the last several decades. These measures, with protectionist policies, have helped fuel the country's transformation into a global manufacturing hub, but they come at a steep price. According to IMF economists, in this new survey report, the fiscal cost, conservatively speaking, amounted to 4.4% of GDP in 2023. Cash subsidies represented the largest chunk at 2% of GDP, followed by tax benefits 1.5%, land subsidies 0.5%, and subsidized credit 0.4%. While state-owned enterprises often enjoy preferential access to loans and higher subsidy rates, private firms also reap significant benefits, particularly through tax breaks in favored sectors. This demonstrates that China's industrial policy extends far beyond propping up state champions. This is also a conservative estimate. There are many ways preferred sectors are supported by the state which are very hard to quantify. Examples include local governments forcing thousands of university students to give free or forced labor to local factories during high season for no wages. Critically, however, the IMF's deeper concern lies not with the direct fiscal burden, but in the drag on productivity, and that is the true cost. By tilting the playing field, subsidies encourage overproduction in certain industries while regulatory and trade barriers shelter incumbents, stifling competition. The result, the report estimates, is a 1.2% hit to total factor productivity compared with a no distortions baseline. In GDP terms, that translates into a loss of up to 2% annually, a meaningful gap for an economy facing slowing growth, demographic headwinds, and deflationary risks. That is to say, according to this report, Beijing's market-manipulating industrial policy is costing the economy 2% annual growth through lost productivity. Globally, China is not alone in showering industries with state support, yet Beijing's heavy reliance on industrial policy makes it an outlier, especially given the scale of its economy. Speaking on this report, Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis observed this week, quote, "By now, most economists know or suspect that there is an overinvestment problem across all sectors. Even the official press acknowledges the possibility. But until something causes consumption growth to surge to 6 to 7%, there is no way that it can be chased with GDP growth targets of 4 to 5%. This is just simple arithmetic. If you know the minimum amount of rebalancing that the Chinese economies need to be sustainable and the maximum amount of time it has to rebalance, you can easily calculate the minimum amount of which consumption growth has to exceed GDP growth, and the minimal amount by which investment growth can decline to reach whatever GDP growth level you choose. The problem is that the numbers are pretty ugly." End quote. Next up, Typhoon Ragasa barreled into southern China on Wednesday, forcing the evacuation of millions of residents in Guangdong province and unleashing powerful winds and torrential rain that battered coastal cities. The storm made landfall on Hailing Island, about 145 miles west of Hong Kong, with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, the equivalent of a Category 3 hurricane. Chinese state media said more than 2 million people were relocated across Guangdong as authorities mobilized 38,000 firefighters and 400 emergency teams. Beijing allocated $21 million in disaster relief to Guangdong, Hainan, and Fujian provinces. A weather station in Jiangmen City recorded gusts of nearly 150 miles an hour, the highest on record there. The storm had already cut a deadly swath through Asia. In Taiwan, raging floodwaters collapsed bridges and inundated towns in Hualien County, leaving at least 17 people dead and dozens injured. More than 8,000 people were evacuated, and rescuers continued searching for those missing. In the Philippines, where the typhoon first made landfall on Monday, 10 people were confirmed dead. Hong Kong was spared a direct hit but endured pounding winds and storm surges that flooded seaside neighborhoods. Authorities reported 90 injuries. Across the city, Disneyland closed, horse races were cancelled, and more than 600 flights were grounded at Hong Kong International Airport. Neighbouring Macau shuttered its casinos as floodwaters turned streets into rivers, forcing rescues by inflatable boats. Meteorologists warn that Ragasa's strength, briefly peaking at 165 miles an hour, making it the world's most powerful storm this year, was fueled by unusually warm sea temperatures. The typhoon is expected to weaken as it pushes westward toward Vietnam and Laos, but with dozens dead, tens of thousands displaced, and billions in damage across multiple countries, Ragasa has already secured its place as one of Asia's most destructive storms in recent years. Next up, China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, pledged for the first time to cut emissions significantly in the coming decade, with General Secretary Xi Jinping unveiling a new set of commitments during a video address to the United Nations Climate Summit on Wednesday. Yesterday, she announced that by 2035, China will reduce its net greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 7 to 10% from their peak levels, with the possibility of deeper cuts. Quote, "Green and low-carbon transition is the trend of our time," end quote, she said, stressing that China would pursue an, quote, "unwavering course," end quote, toward cleaner growth, quote, "despite resistance from some countries," end quote, a veiled reference to the US. The pledge includes a sweeping set of domestic targets. Non-fossil fuel energy will account for more than 30% of China's total consumption within the next decade, while the combined capacity of wind and solar power is expected to exceed 3.6 billion kilowatts, over 6 times the level recorded in 2020. She also promised to expand forest stock to 24 billion cubic meters, accelerate the adoption of new energy vehicles until they dominate new car sales, and broaden the reach of China's national carbon trading market to cover high-emission industries. Commentators cautiously welcomed the news, but warned that China has a track record of backtracking on environmental pledges. Regular China Update viewers will know, however, that China has accelerated its push for green energies for 2 reasons. One, it is highly dependent on international, mostly Middle Eastern oil and gas, and so it sees green technologies as a way of mitigating this risk. And 2, it believes that these will be future industries, and so it wants to dominate the heights of these supply chains. This announcement sets China apart from the US, whose president, Donald Trump, dismissed climate change earlier this week as, quote, "the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world," end quote. She also urged developed countries to lead with stronger climate actions. His remarks highlight China's attempt to position itself as a leader in climate diplomacy, even as the scale of its own coal use and emissions remains the largest in the world. Now, we have one more development to cover, but just quickly, if you want to be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on all things China, specifically, and China's role in the world, including this emerging Cold War between the US and China generally, consider subscribing to China Update. Hit the bell notification icon and you will be. If you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button, and Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. This is an independent channel, relies primarily on your support, and so I appreciate all this amazing help. Thank you so much. And finally for today, US Secretary Scott Bessent struck a combative tone on yesterday, telling US-based Fox Business News that Washington still holds significant leverage in its economic standoff with Beijing. In a wide-ranging interview, Bessent highlighted American dominance in critical technologies, specifically aircraft engines and parts, certain chemicals and plastics, and silicon inputs, as pressure points the US could exploit. Quote, "We're not without levers on our side," end quote, Bessent said. Quote, "We have plenty of products that they depend on us for," end quote. He also cited access to US capital markets, noting that Chinese firms still seek listings on Wall Street despite volatile valuations in Hong Kong and on the mainland. Of Bessent's list, civil aviation may be Washington's strongest card. China's homegrown aircraft manufacturer Comac, C-O-M-A-C, has slashed delivery targets for its C919 jet to just 25 this year, down from an expected 75, as supply chain bottlenecks bottlenecks hit production. Much of the trouble stems from reliance on US suppliers, with engines, avionics, and flight control systems sourced from companies including GE Aerospace and Honeywell. A temporary export halt of GE components in July highlighted just how vulnerable Beijing remains to the sector. The US has wielded this leverage before. When trade tensions escalated in 2023, restrictions on aircraft components helped secure renewed Chinese exports of rare earth magnets. The question now is whether Washington will again use aviation to extract concessions, especially as Beijing seeks to scale its commercial jet industry. Where Bessett's calculus may falter is in agriculture, however. Despite being a traditional flashpoint in trade disputes, US soybeans have not regained traction in the Chinese market. Instead, Beijing has leaned heavily on Brazilian suppliers, importing more than 10 million tons in August alone. Argentina has also become a beneficiary after Buenos Aires suspended export taxes, spurring sales to Chinese buyers. For the first time since records began in 1999, China has not booked a single US soybean cargo 2 weeks into the new marketing season, according to US Department of Agricultural data. That leaves American farmers watching nervously as their biggest customer hedges against reliance on US supply. Bessett's comments come as the Trump administration pursues multiple parallel strategies. The US has opened Section 232 tariff investigations into medical equipment, robotics, and industrial machinery, while G7 nations are weighing price floors to encourage investment in non-Chinese rare earth production. Meanwhile, President Trump is preparing to sign an executive order finalizing the terms of a TikTok deal, showing that technology and national security can be wrapped into the wider trade agenda. So we can see that this trade conflict between the world's two largest economies continues to widen, deepen, and intensify. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I hope to see you for the next episode, which will either be tomorrow, Friday, or on Saturday.